Very good morning to everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the joint seminar titled Tech for All Lab. This event is a collaboration between the Asian Bureau of Finance and Economic Research, the Institute of South Asian Studies at NUS, and the East Asian Institute at NUS. I'm Ramita Iyer, and I'm a research analyst at ISAS. Today's seminar will discuss Tech for All Lab, an initiative by the Harvard Business School's Digital Data and Design Institute. We're delighted to have with us Professor Tarun Khanna, Georgie Paolo Lehman Professor at the Harvard Business School. Today's session will be moderated by Professor Bernard Young, Stephen Ridey Distinguished Professor in Finance and Strategic Management at the NUS Business School. Before we proceed with the event, I would like to inform you that today's seminar is being live streamed on the ISAS Facebook page. I also request everyone to put their phones on the silent mode throughout the event. I now invite Associate Professor Iqbal Singh Sivia, Director of ISAS, to introduce our speaker for today.
Well, we're going to dispense with the normal NUS bureaucratic model of having a formal introduction. We're going to go very informal and straight to Tarun itself. And I'll just say this much, that we are delighted to have Professor Tarun Khanna with us today. And I hope he's going to shed light on the complexities of digital innovations and provide us hope for a more technologically innovative and technologically inclusive world. But before handing the floor, I should make a somewhat of a formal introduction, at least for those of us who do not know all of his accomplishments. Professor Tarun Khanna is Georgie Paolo Lehman Professor at the Harvard Business School. For over 2 decades, he has studied entrepreneurship as a means to social and economic development in emerging markets. He was named the first director of Harvard's Lakshmi Mittal and Family School South Asia Institute. In 2007, he was nominated Young Global Leader under 40 by the World Economic Forum. And he's also been appointed to several national commissions by the Government of India between 2015 and 2019. Now, that's just a summary of all that he's done. So without further ado, can I hand the floor over to you?
Thank you, Iqbal, and thank you, colleagues, for having me say a few words about this initiative that's mentioned is titled the Tech for All Lab, and it's part of a new institute at Harvard Business School called the Data Design and Digitization Institute. I might have mixed up the Ds. There's an alliteration of 3 Ds, but essentially it's data, design, and digital. This lab in particular is jointly organized by my colleague Rembrandt Kenning, who is a quantitative sociologist originally from Stanford and now with us at Harvard. So I'm going to share a few ideas of the lab. The lab's in its inception, I'm actually controlling my screen here and the screen that is being streamed, so it might be a little bit asynchronous for a minute, so please bear with me. So the idea of the Tech for All Lab is a very simple. By way of substantive introduction, let me just say that my own work is with entrepreneurs in developing countries, and I'm interested in entrepreneurship as a way of economic development, as opposed to other lenses of economic development, which of course are very important, whether it's macroeconomic or political stability. Iqbal and I were just talking about the collapse in stability in Sri Lanka as an example of that. So of course, we've got plenty of institutions and scholars looking at that. We have lots of people looking at monetary flows into countries, whether aid is a good idea or not such a good idea, or conditionality in aid and so on. So I'm leaving aside all those super important issues and saying that I'm more interested in individual agency. What can individuals on the ground in developing countries do to change their own futures? And then aggregating up from there. And the spirit of the Tech for All Lab is that in my own work, both as a scholar and as a, I don't know how to describe myself, policy interventionist in India in particular, and as an entrepreneur building companies across the developing world, I find myself increasingly interested in this both conceptually and practically important problem of what's the extent to which technology can be an asset in this quest for greater inclusion. My colleague Rem comes at it slightly differently. he's been very interested. He's an American scholar, and he's very interested but in particular, why you see what I would loosely describe as gender disparity in innovation. So he's got some beautiful papers that demonstrate that most of the innovation that happens, even in the developed world, is done by men. It's a bit of an overstatement, but not a huge overstatement. And interestingly, when it's primarily men that are involved in doing the research and the innovation and the company formation, that disproportionately women's issues are disregarded. It's not implausible when you think about it. And if I have time, I'll show you some specific examples of what he's doing. But we're extrapolating from there to say that just like I'm interested in how 7 out of the 8 of the world's 7 of the 8 billion people in the world, I think are sort of left out of the technological revolution, or at least the cutting edges of it. Rem is interested in why half the people in the world, women, might be also left out in some sense. So we're coming at it in 2 different lenses in a way. I think it's easy to see why this would be important. I'm going to skip this. So the lab's goal, very simply stated, is to produce research that broadens the benefits of digital innovation and entrepreneurship to include, as I said before, more people in developing economies, women, what in the US we refer to as people of color, which includes me, and those in economically disadvantaged circumstances or regions. That's the purpose of the lab. As I said, it's a very new construct, and both of us are coming to it with pre-existing trajectories of work. I'm a lot older than Rem is, so I've got several decades of work, and Rem is a few years into his already illustrious career. As you can see, we've got a this is an eye chart, so you can't read it, but suffice it to say that there's a bunch of faculty, a bunch of research associates, and this is on our website. So I'll leave you to get to it. We essentially have, so what I thought I'd do in the somewhat limited time is give you a flavor of the kinds of research we're trying to do and the kinds of research that I'm hoping is part of the pipeline of what we are starting to set up. First and primarily in the initial years, we're interested in initiating collaborations between companies and academics. So we want to be a clearinghouse for scholars like ourselves and other people who are interested from diverse disciplines, but primarily those with a quantitative bent. To not exclusively, but primarily those with a quantitative bent, to come and to work with us very closely with individual organizations, and I'll give you 1 or 2 concrete examples, so that we can help these organizations to understand how they might actively use technology to advance their own business purposes or purposes of their organization or nonprofit or what have you. And that turns out, for those of you like myself who serve on many corporate boards or who are entrepreneurs as well, this is a fiendishly difficult proposition. It's one thing for us, for Bernie and me to write theorems on the board or to run regressions to show that something is happening, but to actually get someone to implement it, particularly at large scale, is neither harder nor less difficult. It's just a very different kind of challenge. And so we want to take that challenge seriously and say, is there room for a genuine academic and practical collaboration that can have measurable progress on the ground? So our normal measure of progress, nothing wrong with it. That's what I've subscribed to as an academic my entire several decades of work, is to put out an idea there, put it through the peer review process, have it published, and then in the fullness of time, once it runs the gamut of the contestation of ideas, it eventually starts affecting practice. And very few of us are actually vested in the idea of measuring that progress. So we want to flip that around. We want to actually start with the problem statement, devise a solution that is informed by academic rigor, and see it implemented almost immediately and measure the progress. So it's a very different way of proceeding. And in a sense, it's inspired more by the natural sciences, right? So you might have a disease condition and you say, I need a targeted drug to deal with that disease condition. And I work with the patient population in a hospital and I introduce the drug and I see the result, right? So that's sort of the loose inspiration. And I don't think it's novel to us, but we're trying to put it together formally with governance and then at scale. The second, this is a bit vaguer. I'm just referring to it here, and I don't like this phraseology, but I'll use it nonetheless. Hypothesis-driven products, which is we build our own data and tech tools that might be idiosyncratic to the needs of a particular company. Simple things, so that we can help them elicit the data that they might normally be blind to, and then use that data to do the research and then implement the results of that research using the same tools. So again, as you can see, it's the nexus that I think is the organizational innovation that's being posited here in the Tech for All lab. And lastly, we're launching a Substack on Jan 1, 23, just featuring, a monthly or eventually a weekly interview, papers, etc. And then also innovating on using technology to teach. I've been teaching courses now that are blended courses, partly asynchronous content being disseminated online, as has become quite customary in the post-COVID world, but then also supplemented by live synchronous interactive discussion, and trying to prototype, maybe even pioneer algorithms to help us run interactive discussions with 1,000 people at a time. Which sounds crazy to try to do, but we've had some initial success, so it's sort of fun. But you can see why that fits within Tech for All as a lab, because if you can reach 10,000 students at once and give a semblance of interactivity, that's pretty cool. It may not be as good as having everybody sitting in a room like us and having face-to-face discussions, but it's a lot better than anonymous dissemination of content in some ways. Happy to speak more about that. I'm actually very excited about that also. So for a variety of idiosyncratic reasons, we happen to be focused on Africa when this lab was jump-started a few months ago. And so promptly we went out and found three very interesting companies that were chomping at the bit to work with us and say, yes, we have a problem, we want you to work on it immediately. And so one of them is a company started by a former student of ours. It's Africa's biggest maize farm. Corn maize farm, Babangona. Babangona is a Hausa word in Nigeria that just means, what does it mean? Big farm, great farm. That's what it means. And it's got about 100,000 farmers. And it's trying to aggregate them in so-called trust groups. And the trust groups sort of help each other, share ideas, have some mutual self-insurance mechanisms, and raise the productivity of how maize farming is done. And so that's the Babangona idea. Yoko is a fintech in South Africa. And the third, which I'm precluded from naming, is an Egyptian online e-commerce type of platform that is particularly focused on women. And then separately, particularly since our gracious hosts here are from a South Asia related organization, I've been very active in the policy circles with the Indian Prime Minister and the PMO, trying to put in place a policy framework for India to allow for digital dissemination. I thought I would just give a little bit of a flavor for that. So in the interest of time, let me just do, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to move this. I forgot to move this forward. This is what I was referring to, the Babangona. So as I mentioned, I'm operating two stacks that are not connected here, one on my laptop and one this, so I apologize. But this is sort of the universe of things, and I'm going to essentially talk a little bit about Babangona, maybe a bit about Yoko, which is a fintech in South Africa, and a little bit about the India policy experiments that are also about extremely large scale digitization to bring 1 billion people onto the online economy in a variety of ways that have not been done at least quite that way. So let me go to Babangona. So Babangona is it's called organizing AI is the wrong title. Using artificial intelligence in Nigerian agriculture is the way I would phrase it. By the way, the spirit for Babangona, the reason Kola and Lola Masha, the husband-wife team who started it is because unemployment in Nigeria is massive. Youth unemployment in Nigeria is massive due to, insurgency, unrest, corruption, political instability, despite it being a wealthy country in terms of petroleum reserves. You would have heard of Boko Haram, which is insurgency in northern Nigeria. And in fact, that's where this company started in part of the insurgency, to try to create better employment opportunities for younger Nigerians so that they wouldn't, I presume, get pulled into the insurgency. But essentially it provides training and education to these farmers, provides some financial credit, helps them with agricultural inputs, and then with harvesting and marketing support. So it's a full system approach to helping. And again, this is not unique to Nigeria. There are lots of examples of agricultural interventions like this that I can think of in a dozen different developing countries. What's interesting here is the scale that Kola Masha has been able to achieve, over 100,000 farmers just in Nigeria, and just in a small part of Nigeria. So if you fast forward, and if this team is successful, as I fervently wish they will be, you could imagine, several hundreds of thousands of farmers pulled together in a system that is quite cool. So here's the particular intervention. So they have been collecting tens of millions of images, your basic phone images, along with farm productivity and input usage, right? And what happens is that you have these agents. You see the man in the white dress in the middle of the rather small image there. So he's the one who goes around to each of these trust groups and essentially engages with farmers on his motorbike, and then uses their phones to give advice, check in, answer questions, things like that. So what we're developing is a state-of-the-art tool using basic machine learning that can be used by the farmer, and collaborating with different experts to try to use this. Now, I can think of at least 3 or 4 different efforts of which I know, and I'm not an expert in this field. There was a very nice text-based, and there were a lot of very good economics papers written on this in mainstream journals, text-based tool to advise farmers in India about rainfall patterns and how to deal with aberrant rainfall patterns, and then where you could buy limited insurance and how you could construct insurance products. So that's a whole dimension that has been developed in India.
Is it possible to interrupt, to ask questions?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Like, what's in my mind is like, who started this organization?
This Nigerian farm? The
So is it
Nigerian farm?
private or public?
Yeah, this is a commercial
It's a
private
commercial
company. Yeah.
And then then your intervention is to collate the data and apply machine learning.
That's the starting point of the intervention, right?
Thank you.
And-
Now I understand. Thank you.
Yeah. So what's interesting is this kind of company, whole separate side issue. It's a commercial venture. It's not the kind of venture in an insurgency-prone emerging market that commercial capital will fund. There's just no way on God's good earth that commercial capital will fund this. So one of the ingenious things that these entrepreneurs have done is put together what I would call, Bernie, a blended capital stack. Right? So they've gone out and raised some money from foundations, some from development financial institutions, particularly in Europe. Avians or the Germans or somebody have provided some base capital, and then they've got layers of private equity on top of it, essentially. But it's a commercial organization. So what we are interested in here is not so much the nature of the machine learning tool, but whether the existence of these machine learning and AI tools will change the organization structure of Babangona. That's the conceptual issue. And at least in the, I don't want to get overly technical here, but in the field of organizational economics, there's a lot of thinking about the appropriate degree of decentralization and who has what authority and who has what decision rights and control rights in large sprawling organizations. So we're interested in the interaction between the technical tool that's being created to help and how it affects the way an organization can scale to ultimately encompass 500,000 farmers or more. And that's an open question. So that's a very small glimmer of something that we've just initiated. Now you can imagine that getting this thing up and running, this is probably the first project of this Tech for All lab, has taken a lot of work with lawyers, general counsels at Harvard and at the company, deciding who owns what data, what's doable, what's not doable, and so on. So those are teething pains for us. Yeah.
I'm curious, has Babangona organized all of the 100,000 farmers to be part of a single organization, or are these farmers operating independently, loosely as a
Somewhere in between. So it's not a single organization. It's more, as I said, they're organized in these so-called trust groups or trust circles. I forget the terminology. There is a Harvard Business case study that we wrote, so you can download it from the web, but it describes it in some detail. And so what they have is, I'm making these numbers up, but they may have maybe 500 of these trust groups, and each of them has a certain number of farmers and a leader, and they have measurement protocols to see how they're doing and which intervention needs to make sense. But it's all sort of manual and semi-automated, but not using modern techniques in any way. And then those that are successful, the trust group leaders are given incentives to grow their own mini babangonas. So it's like almost like an Avon, Avon type of structure in some ways. Yeah. So
trust groups, are they organized by tribes? Because I remember
yes,
Nigeria has some very strong.
Yeah, no, they're not.
They even had some nasty wars.
They're not organized. And the reason is that this entire exercise so far is only in one area of Nigeria where everybody's the same. But you're right, over time that will be an issue. Anyway, I'm just giving you a flavor of a particular type. Completely different examples, South African small and medium enterprises. So we have data from, let me go to, so this is a company called Yoko. We have data from this company. It's a fintech. It's a fintech company that serves about 250,000 small and medium-sized merchants. And the merchants really don't really know how to use the data, essentially, nor does the fintech really know how to optimize this. So we're trying different things. For instance, in the bottom right of the screen, you can see we might have a simple experiment that's a control group of these merchants who do business as usual. We might have a dashboard that provides them with various summary information, perhaps comparing how a particular merchant is doing to others in a sensibly defined peer group. We might have a different group where we engage with the merchant and engage them in almost like a conversation, technology-mediated conversation of whatever is happening to you, why is it happening to you, to get them to think a little bit about it. It's almost like a mini case discussion at the level of the merchant. Or we might have a combination where there is some comparative data and a little bit of a case discussion to see if you can prompt them to think a little bit creatively about the business situation that they've ended up in. I think this is sort of a little bit heroic to pull off, but my colleagues think that this might work. So we're going to give it a shot in some ways. Yeah.
At first, I mean, let's be interactive. So if
anybody wants to, I mean, we've had a couple of people, but please jump in. Yeah.
Let me ask you this question, because as you explain this thing, a few things pop into my head. One is about essentially is a private company with a lot of data.
Yeah.
And you have access to the data, you collate the data, and you've used the data and machine learning to generate domain knowledge that can be used by the company to help the farmers.
That's
so
the first
there are
one.
two things.
Yeah, that was the first example, right?
Right. So the two things in my mind. Number one is that how transportable is this domain knowledge? And second, is there ever any intellectual property right questions? In this world, we always debate about who has the right to data, individual, company, or the government.
Yeah, so it's a very good question to raise. On the generalizability issue, so we're from the Harvard side, we're doing this as an academic project. So we're not going to retain the intellectual property of whatever we create. That will belong to the company, and they're free to use it in whatever way they form. The rights that we will retain is a right to use the data for our academic purposes, and to write a paper on it, and to preserve the right for the company not to try to restrict the publication of whatever comes out of it, which is sort of fairly normal in any collaborative agreement. But the intellectual property belongs to the companies. We're not trying to hang on to that in any sense, at least not that I know of. This Yoko I think our former student Hyunjin, who was asking questions, I think you're involved in this project, right, in some way. So this is a second example of what we are up to. I'm going to skip this one and go to the Indian examples for a second. So let me see, which one should I do first? Okay, since it's a funny picture, let me try this. This is a cartoon of India's Prime Minister Modi sitting in one of these ramshackled three-wheelers, leapfrogging the automobile world, in a sense. It's a joke from some newspaper that I pulled out. But the idea is, can we find a way for a poor country that's been lagging in technology in general to leapfrog on some dimensions? You know, much as you saw in Africa with the cell phones leapfrogging the landline systems. And there is one example of this that has had really quite extraordinary spillover benefits, and it's referred to in India as Aadhaar, which is the Aadhaar in Sanskrit and Hindi means foundation, and it's essentially a unique biometric digital ID that is assigned to every resident of India, right? It's not a citizenship-based thing. So I'm not a resident of India, so I don't have an Aadhaar, even though I'm a citizen of India. And there are plenty of people who are residents of India or not citizens of India, lots of expats who have an Aadhaar ID. So it's a residence-based, it's not driven by national security type reasoning. It's not driven by FBI type reasoning. It's driven more with the developmental goal of the Indian state finally having visibility to everybody who lives within its borders, so that it can engage in the judicious dissemination primarily of public goods of different sorts. That's the way I internalize it, how it was initially conceptualized by the tech entrepreneurs who came around to try to do it. I think I'm kind of curious, how many people, I mean, there's some people in this room who look like they're of South Asian extraction, but how many of you know about Aadhaar? Can you raise your hands in this room? How many have no idea what I'm talking about? Some people neither raise their hand or another. So I'll assume that most people don't know, or many people don't know. So this is literally genuinely a leapfrog, right? It's a leapfrog ahead of everybody in the developed world. It's a leapfrog ahead of China by far. It's a leapfrog ahead of basically everybody, essentially. And what it is it's a system of protocols that started being developed in the around 2012, 2013, something like that. Is that right? Yeah, about 2012, a little before 2010 maybe. And the idea was that for every resident, there would be a large-scale effort to collect what ended up being, and there are lots of books written on this already by now, to collect essentially all 10 fingerprints and the iris scans, right, to create a unique biometric ID for everybody. And then that would be used for the pure and express purpose only of authenticating the identity of the individual in all subsequent transactions that they engage in, either with the state or with commercial entities. So it becomes a piece of the digital infrastructure of the country. And this is in a country where half the people didn't have a birth certificate. Very few people had, almost nobody had passports. People had these so-called ration cards, which were used to distribute subsidized food grains in particular, and were subject to endemic fraud, because you had people who carried multiple ration cards to avail of subsidized food. And you had people who, because they were socially marginalized, could not even get access to their ration card. So lots of fraud everywhere, tens of billions of dollars wasted each year. And now everybody has got a unique digital ID. I think the enrollment out of 1.3 billion people is probably close to 1.29 or something. I don't know, it's pretty much done at this point. And it's quite incredible because now, as a simple example, the one that's most personally evocative to me, it used to be that if you had to pay, particularly a woman in India, the chance that the money would get into the pocket of the woman was pretty low, right? Somebody would try to steal it along the way. I'm talking about the vulnerable sections of society, the less educated people, or the man in the woman's life would somehow get his hands on the money, and sad to say, very often it would be misappropriated either by the husband or the son or the brother or what have you. And now the money is connected to the biometric ID. So in effect, it's connected to your eye, right? Which is a pretty cool idea. And the eye is connected to a bank account, and there is no cash, right? So I go up, I show my eye, and I'm owed 1,000 rupees, and the 1,000 rupees materializes, non-materially materializes in my bank account, which nobody else can touch because it's only accessible through my eye. So there is no fraud, no cash, no nothing. It's just an extraordinarily simple idea that was hard to pull off. Yeah.
I think part of the criticism.
Oh, and there are lots of criticisms. Yeah, but go ahead.
Privacy and
Yeah.
the security.
Yeah.
Because there's,
Yeah.
I mean, that's one part of it. There's also several people
Yeah.
and several villages that have the same date of birth on their Aadhaar, and this is not,
Yeah.
one-off incidents.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm just curious.
I mean, in a nutshell, it's mostly debunked by scholars. You're right. The privacy issues are serious. And I think, so I'm not involved with creating Aadhaar, just to be clear. Even though people who have built it are friends of mine now at this, professional colleagues who I know. The privacy issues are real. And I think taken very seriously by the data architects who set up the entire enterprise. This is, by the way, this is truly an extraordinary story. We teach it at HBS now as, I don't know, I would say state of the art of how you build large scale tech systems anywhere in the world. This is not just about poor countries. And the privacy issues have, again, appropriately been litigated in the courts for the last 5 or 7 years, going up to the Supreme Court in India, which finally ruled in favor of Aadhaar, right? Saying that there is, the way that Aadhaar is being used with all the safeguards, there is extremely minimal risk to any form of privacy. Just to be clear, let's say you have an Aadhaar ID, there is no circumstance, let's say, and I am a vendor in India that wants to engage in a transaction with you, either pay you something or get some money from you in return for some transaction that we engage in, and I want to authenticate your identity. In the US, I would have to show my driver's license, which is a physical thing with a photograph, which is plenty subject to manipulation, right? But in this case, all I would do is we would scan your fingerprint, and the only thing that would happen is the central database would be queried, and within 3 seconds, there would be a yes/no answer that says that this person is the person that she says that she is. That's it. No data is sent, so there's no issue of privacy. There's nothing. There's no data ever being sent out. The only way that the privacy can be compromised is if the central thing can be hacked in any way, and that nobody's been able to do so far. Is it totally hack-proof? Nothing is totally hack-proof, but it's never happened so far. Anyway, the courts have adjudicated this, and the privacy issues, I think, are real, but have been put to rest for all practical purposes. The other stuff about fraud, honestly, I don't know what to make of it, because you hear it, and there's no evidence anywhere, and all the systematic evidence that's been provided has been against it, including in global peer-reviewed stuff. And so I think that's all I'm going to say about it, because it's not my interest to enter into a conversation about. I'm just using it as an example of digitization in some ways. What's interesting about, and the reason I'm describing this is that it's a wonderfully fertile set of settings within which we can participate as a Tech for All lab, right? Because suddenly there is a big technology, a sort of almost like a general purpose technology that's out there, sort of like reading and writing and computing in some ways, that suddenly 1.3 billion people are able to be identified when they couldn't be identified before. And so is there anything that we can do with that technology for stimulating productive commerce, or productive distribution of goods, et cetera? What Aadhaar has done, because it's been so successful, by the way, here's some simple numbers. The total money spent in implementing Aadhaar throughout the big country was less than $2 billion. Right? The annual savings just in reducing fraud in the distribution of subsidized food grains, the annual savings, so it's a run rate, is tens of billions of dollars. the annual saving in, removing corruption in the distribution of LPG, liquefied petroleum gas, which is used for cooking, is probably in the tens of billions. So you're talking about an intervention that costs, call it $2 billion, that has a run rate savings of several tens of billions of dollars annually. That's a really good investment for anybody to have undertaken. One of the things that the Aadhaar thing has spawned is something that now is called the India Stack, and it's been organized by the government. And I just put up over here, there is a way to, it's called a consent layer. I'm not actually equipped to go into the technical details of all this because I haven't had the time to study it. But there's a digital locker where you can keep things like your school and college transcripts, which are subject to endemic fraud all the time, so that any time in the rest of your career, you could use your Aadhaar ID and access to the digital locker that is a public good, right? And use it in job interviews and say, yes, you can, I give consent for my college transcript to be sent to that particular situation, all done digitally without any intervention. There's legally binding electronic signing. There's a beautiful payment system now called the United Payment Interface, UPI, which makes payment seamless and cheapest in the world and not monopolized by anybody. That's the key word, not monopolized by anybody. Sorry. Let's see, what is this? This is I just took a screenshot this morning from India Stack. So India Stack is the sort of NGO. Well, I don't know what to call it. Is it really an NGO, or it's sort of like a government affiliated or government approved NGO? But it just reports the statistics on 1.35 billion Aadhaar enrollments, 130 billion payment transactions, and so on and so forth. And this is a running counter that sort of keeps on going. Here's a depiction of the different, the logo on the left is Aadhaar, the one in the center, UPI is the United Payment Interface. Let me say a word about the difference from the US and China, right? Which actually was prompted in, how would I say it, in circles of intelligentsia, well-meaning people, both in India and in the US, just debating, because we were all watching the way in which the tech companies in the US and in China, until President Xi recently curtailed some of their power, but how a handful of tech companies had acquired real dominance on data, right? Whether it's the Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook, Google's in the US, or Tencent and Alibaba and so on. And they were all private companies. And even now, when you read the text that Lisa has reported in the global press about what's happening in China, the concern is that should a private company, even this morning in the Financial Times, there was an update on that Ant Financial IPO that got torpedoed last year, where Mr. Ma's group is trying to find a different way to raise financing through another privately held entity that's partially owned by him. And the government entities are competing and saying, we're not really comfortable with the private entity having proprietary access to all this data in some way, because it's not clear that it'll be used for the public purpose. In any case, a bunch of us thought that it would be really good if the highways of the future, which are not just the physical roads, but the data highways of the future, were owned in public trust as a public utility, as opposed to owned by individual private corporations. And so that's what we've done. And it has been spectacular in just 2 or 3 years, right? Because suddenly you have, the UPI is a great example. You had these private entrepreneurs. In fact, some of them were funded. In fact, one of them, Paytm, which is one of India's dominant payment systems. You can go anywhere, you see these Paytm logos that you can pay for your groceries or your, just like you pay in the taxi cab here with WeChat Pay or something like that. You could do that. Paytm was backed, I think, by SoftBank, and was off to a $20-30 billion valuation IPO. And UPI came out. And UPI basically said that a lot of the proprietary advantages that were until that time held by individual private entities, there was going to be a common interface, and everybody was required, every fintech was required to go through that interface so that there would be interchangeability. So you couldn't essentially say, I have a lock on all the customers and nobody else can come in over here. A lot of it was ruled undoable because the India stack had built the software for the United Payment Interface in the background. And so Paytm, had to deal with that and suffered a diminution in its position. Still very, very useful, very impressive entity. So this is sort of the second kind of thing I wanted to mention about general digitization in a developing country. In this case, I really do think it's an attempt to leapfrog digital public good architecture in a way that now enables a continuum of possible experiments that can be run with individual companies that might have been harder to do in different contexts. And we're trying to figure out exactly how to interface with this behemoth type of entity. The last thing I'll say is something that I have some responsibility for creating, fortunately. It's called the Atal Innovation Mission, and Atal is just the name that has a double meaning. It was the name of one of India's previous prime ministers, but it also means first. The word Atal means first. And it's called the Innovation Mission, again, Government of India owned. So in 2015, I led a commission to think about policy at the national level, at the behest of the Prime Minister, think about policy at the national level for how are we going to promote entrepreneurship across the country and not have it constrained to pockets in Bangalore or a couple of other places. And by entrepreneurship, I have a very big tent definition of it. Could be people doing for-profit ventures, could be not-for-profit entrepreneurship, anything that's really creative. And one of the nice things that came out of it was the Atal Innovation Mission, which is really the policy implementation of our report in some ways. So things that it does, sponsors hundreds of incubators across the country, including in backward areas where you wouldn't normally have a commercial incubator, so that people have a chance to go and build companies. But one of the things I want to talk about is this particular thing that's referenced on the, oh, I see, I went backwards here, so I'm going to show you. This is the problem with the asynchronous. I again forgot to shift it, sorry. This is the Atal Innovation Mission. But the box on the upper left refers to these things called Atal Tinkering Labs. So I just want to talk about that for 1 second. It's just one tiny piece of this big policy effort that's been enshrined in India now. What this is it's a makerspace, a tinkering lab, so to speak. We use the term tinkering lab, which is about the size of this room in high schools in India. Right? Very poor high schools, very rich high schools, doesn't matter, across the socioeconomic diversity, led by a teacher. And what the room has is basic equipment that these days are a commodity that you can source in the global market for pennies on the dollar compared to what it used to be. You could have 3D printers, you could have biomaterials, you have soft robotics, you have circuit boards, you have simulation engines, you have laptops, you have graphical display. These are all dirt cheap now in the world. And so for almost nothing, you can equip a school with all this stuff. And then you know what? You don't do anything. You let the kids go in and you let them play. And they play and they make things and they make robots and they make gadgets. And then you introduce them to the local community. The local community comes in and says, these are the things we're working on. And just like that, they make interventions that work in the local community. And enshrined in the inventions are principles of basic physics, basic flow, biology, chemistry, material science. You can communicate all that. So suddenly it's become fun, right? With a pretty minuscule amount of investment. So we've opened 10,000 of these now. I would say maybe 3,000-4,000 work really well, and the rest are, works in progress, because of course you still need a little bit of hand-holding. You need a teacher who buys into the mission, the local community come in and act as mentors. But the aim is to go to 50,000 labs in high schools across the country. And you can imagine the change in mindset that this will create. So I'm very excited about what's happening in India on the tech front, partly because of the digital public goods that are being created. as an attempt to bypass the problems that the US and China are experiencing with private monopolization of the goods, as well as with this grassroots effect that I was so lucky and privileged to have a role in creating on catalyzing sort of, grassroots fervor. Yeah.
What was the reasoning for the selection of the first 10,000 labs locations across India? How did you go about selecting those first 10,000 locations?
So I can give you a flavor because I don't remember the details. I mean, there was a very well thought out protocol that combined some sort of efficiency rationale for where we should put them first to see what we can learn. But also, like in any democracy where you have contending interests, you want to make sure there's equitable distribution. And we wanted to go work, bend over backwards to make sure that the most disadvantaged regions got access to these labs pretty soon. So, in the northeast of India, as you may be familiar, it's very relatively less developed area. There's border contestation. People feel generally left out relative to the rest of the mainland. And so we've got a lot over there, for instance. So a combination of what you would do if you just wanted to maximize the impact, the short run impact, versus some attention to long run kind of fairness criteria and so on. Yeah. So, yeah.
Are these labs more in urban settings?
No, they're rural also. They're all over. They're, socioeconomically backward regions. One of the things that I'm trying to persuade the government is to allow us to have a rigorous evaluation of these things. So far, I've not made sufficient progress with that because they would like to release their own evaluation, which is less compelling.
Has any unintended negative consequence? Is there any?
Not in a huge way. I mean, there's all this predictable stuff within the high schools, right? There's internal angst about who's running what and our resources being diverted
I'm
and so
thinking
on.
like in my racket mind, I would say, now I know who to sell cigarettes to.
Who to sell?
Who to house cigarettes to.
Oh,
I can
well,
use the word drug, because I
Oh.
have all the IDs, I know who's doing what and so on. So I optimize and know how to push my drug.
No, so I'm missing that, Bernie. What's the connection to the tinkering labs?
No, I'm thinking that
Yeah.
since you have all the information, and if I do clever analytics on the data, then I know whom to target for what I want to do.
Oh, but in this, we're not really collecting any data on the kids. We're just opening the labs in schools. There's no data being collected back there. It's just literally a room. You go into a school, you find a room, and you hand over the equipment and you go away.
I see. Got it.
And honestly, it's all self-organization. Sorry.
I just thought, for the purpose of the live streamers.
Thank you.
Okay.
I grew up lecturing in large lecture halls without equipment, so my voice is good. But or related question to especially the first part.
Yeah.
You're aiming your innovation at the lower part of society, the deep thing, what my colleague and friend C.K. Prahalad called the bottom of the pyramid.
So what are you referring to? Which
In
intervention?
other words, your innovative activities.
Yeah.
The aim is to develop those with a specific focus on the parts of society that need help or that are behind or whatever. The
Sure.
bottom, as I say, the bottom of the
Okay,
pyramid,
sure. Yeah,
as
if you like.
they
Yeah.
used to call it. So this is my assumption correct?
Let's go with that.
Sorry.
It's just to make it universal.
Related to that is, for example, in your
Yeah.
first example, many
Uh-huh.
of the techniques that has been developed for the small maize farmers.
Yeah.
Will also apply to the big sophisticated farmers. I mean,
Possibly. Yeah.
I look at this and I've been around for the US farm for a while. And of course, the farmers nowadays are high capital equipment.
Yeah.
Extremely sophisticated.
Yeah.
Weather reports, and you know all
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
So the question is how to keep the focus on those people who really need help, which is probably tougher goal than to apply the innovation among more clever people.
Well, that's the whole purpose of the lab is to make sure that we don't get captured only by the very large sophisticated farmers in that example, and that we are using technology to benefit populations that are not using technology, which is correlated with what you're calling the bottom of the pyramid, but not entirely, I think. Because, for instance, you have women farmers who are using less technology for whatever reason, and so they're not at the bottom of the pyramid in any sense, the way CK used to describe it anyway. Yeah, so that's
May
the part.
interrupt here.
Yeah.
Well, you know that you were nominated, you know, that and so on. So I add something here that I thought about. What CK talk about is innovating for the bottom of the pyramid.
Yes, yes.
What this will do is beyond that. It will allow, it will facilitate, enable and stimulate innovation from the bottom of the pyramid. It's more than
Yes,
just for
actually.
them, but from them.
That would be the aspiration.
Then I missed it so far.
No, that's
Thanks for.
no, that's a very useful thing. In an ideal world, it would be both, right? So, you know, CK was a mentor to me in many ways, and but I don't think the fortune at the bottom of the pyramid, the way his book titled it, was ever really manifest.
Yes.
It's a conceptually very good idea, but getting it implemented was difficult. So, you know, maybe the collective we, all of us, have another stab at it, right? Using technology now to see if we can actually unlock that. That would be nice and a good tribute to that gentleman. But more than that, that also there might be innovation that comes out of it that Bernie is saying that is generally useful, I hope. That's the idea, yeah.
Could I just ask one quick question as well? In a sense, these labs are also an intervention in pedagogy as well. I wonder if
Yes, very much, yeah. I'm sorry, you want to finish? No, very much. So, as I said, the process through which this whole mission, I'd encourage you, if anybody is interested, to go to the website. It's just aim.gov.in. But it's really a whole spectrum of interventions for policy making about entrepreneurship. And that was a result of a brainstorming that I led, a commission that I led, a national commission that, you know, was run in a very, please allow me to say, very transparent way and a very public way, so that we opened it up to public scrutiny from day one. People could give comments, we incorporated as best as we could. And of course, there's contestation of ideas. But one of the results of particularly this tinkering labs, as Iqbal is saying, it really is potentially a game changer for how science is taught in high schools. And so it's been appropriate for us to now go to the Ministry of Education in India and say, hey, listen, we're doing this. Is there any way that we can partner with you? And, you know, like any government silos, that's a tricky exercise. Education is always a heavily politicized field in any country, and India is no exception. So shall we just say it's work in progress?
Tyrone, do you have more examples to share, or should we open it to?
No, you know, we're almost out of time, so I'm happy to take any comments or suggestions or critiques or whatever occurs to people.
In order to solicit more input, more comments, and have and invigorate the dialogue, let me say the following. What we're hearing is that there exists data and to some extent technology. And we know that this kind of thing allow us to use in a wide, use like the IHA thing in India and so on, allow us to use that to develop a lot of knowledge, develop a lot of prediction as well as better optimization. And now what you are talking about, Tyrone, is that you're making a movement to make that more widespread, to help more people to participate in that. So in the Africa example or in the India examples, and a lot of this are like that, and we can follow this mode of vertically combined effort, you know, between Harvard and Africa, or between us and India, and so on and so forth. And so I have, in order to start the conversation, I have the following questions in my mind. Number one, as my earlier question indicate, I worry about user integrity. So how do we safeguard ourselves from the possibility that there are people who use all the I identities and to do something unthinkable? Okay, we have to think about the user's integrity. Number two, I have to worry about If I make everything wide open, then I have to worry about the incentive to innovate. If everything is wide open, I see the data, I can optimize, I do something. Immediately, Gunther can mimic and copy. So I lose my incentive to innovate. Then the third thing that not bothers me, but third thing in my mind is like, I like the idea of data utility, but how do you incentivize people to feed back into the data pool, to continue to enlarge the data pool, so that if I solve problem number one, problem number two, that I can enhance the goodies out of and enlarge the data, make it publicly available. In a way, it's like think of not data and technology, but just think of you create a big public library. Anyone can go to the library and read the book and become a better person, better thinker, better entrepreneurs, and so on. And you want them to write more books and bring more books into the library. So that's the third part of my question.
Yeah, I mean, those are all very well thought through, conceptualized, and appropriate questions, I think. You know, on the first issue of what's the extent of publicness of public goods, how far do you take that, right? It's sort of like the road. I mean, I literally think of it as a road. We have a road and we don't question the public good nature of the road. And we all use it, and we all use it equivalently. We drive, we walk, we cycle on it, and we use it for productive purposes. So I think the analogy here is literally these are digital roads in some sense. But you're right, if we take it to too much of an extreme and you start saying that, okay, anything good that this gentleman did and that gentleman did, by definition is part of our public good, then they're going to stop doing what they do. So you're absolutely right. But I think we're very far from that. We're in a situation where you had, you know, in our case in India, for 1.3 billion people, 1.4 billion people, you probably had only, you know, 0.3 billion that were plugged in. And so the existence of the road is kind of bringing them all in for the first time. So again, I think we're at a corner solution and we're sort of moving towards what I would describe as closer to an internal optimum, but that is a consideration to think about. The other one, I really like the library metaphor, which is there's a public library and everybody else can avail of it freely. But then how do we create the incentives so that people keep on writing books to contribute back to the public library? Yeah, that's a good thing to think through. And I, you know, off the top of my head, I would think that you'll have all the usual agglomeration incentive problems. Let's say you had a collection of people who were working in a particular industry and they all had, you know, data that could be contribute to the, you'll have all the usual antitrust issues, you'll have all the usual local public goods issues that need to be adjudicated. But they're good questions, Bernie, I agree. Yeah. I just put up this one other thing up here, which is I think, you know, I think when you're trying to build something like whether it's what has become India's national policy for innovation, the Atal Innovation Mission, or in a tiny sense, this lab that we're building at Harvard, I think communicating is so important. So as a way of communicating, we're creating this monthly and eventually weekly newsletter that for now, every month, February of 23, will profile an entrepreneur. And I've just put up some examples over here. The one on the right is a company that I have some affiliation with in Bangalore, Niramai, which is one of the best examples of thermal breast cancer screening that has really moved the possibility of diagnosis of breast cancer, not just for India, but for the world, in a dramatically new direction that's super cheap and is poised to get approved around the world. That's a great example of technology for all in some ways. There's another example that's coming to mind. One of my colleagues at Harvard is an expert, one of the world's experts on you know, biological exoskeletons. Right? So things that are used for a variety of purposes, rehab purposes for accident victims, right, to facilitate mobility or to retrain people to walk after they've had spinal injury or accidents and so on, or neurological damage. or even used in army for people who are carrying large equipment to have these exoskeletons that allow them to move swiftly with large equipment. But that technology, I don't like the army example so much, but that technology can be used really brilliantly for disabled people. And remember, Tech for All is not just in the development context, it's technology for anybody who is disenfranchised. And disenfranchised may include a minority group, it might include, gender minorities in some ways, it might include disabled people. And so we're really trying to think holistically about this. And the Substack is going to be a way for us to communicate this and to build a constituency going forward. But this is an academic project, the Tech for All Lab, and it's open to anyone. So if anybody's interested in affiliating or participating or have suggestions, you can just go on the website and email us, and we're happy to engage in a conversation and see if we can move things forward. So, yeah.
A lot of the examples, thank you. A lot of the examples that you've given, and including the Substack, clearly one of the goals of the lab is to communicate, highlight, and document like what the impact of these really amazing initiatives that are happening in developing countries might be. The other thing that you talked about at the beginning of your talk was this hypothesis-driven products, or really thinking about, beyond documenting and communicating the amazing work that these companies, individuals, maybe governments are doing, like how do we push it forward more? Could you talk a little bit more about what your hopes are, what you have in mind in terms of that direction?
Yeah. So that's a good thought. How much time do we have?
Supposedly we finish at 35, but if the audience allow us, can we just extend this?
I'll just respond to this question briefly, and then we can wrap it.
I think it's okay to extend this to 45.
Sure.
No?
So what's a good example? Let me see if I can find a slide. I skipped over that because interest of time.
Oh, okay.
So this isn't a direct response to the question, but this is a busy chart. I'm not sure. I'm just going to describe what's on it. And what we're trying to, this is Rem's, my colleague Rem's work. Whose ideas do tech workers want to solve, right? And what the subtext says in the top is using text data on what a startup says it is doing, right? We can classify whether the startup is more or less likely to be serving men or women. Okay, that's a starting point. And then we can see whether men or women are more likely to want to work for that startup. And what you find is a simple correlation is that startups that are talking about primarily serving women tend to attract more women to want to come and work there, more women talent. And the flip side is that when you only have a bunch of men that are doing it, they tend not to focus on the women products, and they tend not to attract women engineers. And you end up in this reinforcing equilibrium, where in the extreme case, there are a bunch of men who are doing things for men. And in theory, there are a bunch of women who are doing things for women, except that there are no women in the tech workforce, relatively speaking. So you get a very lopsided equilibrium. And so we are trying to think of, so if the hypothesis here, Hanjin, is that having more women involved, framing it in a more women-friendly way will encourage more women-centric innovation, that's a hypothesis. And we can generate a bunch of tools to put that hypothesis forward in front of a pool of would-be innovators and see if we can skew the distribution of effort towards being more women-appropriate or women-friendly. It's a testable hypothesis. It requires us to create some, frankly, pretty simple tech interface tools that I can certainly code, and I know you code better than me, you can do it. And we can see if our hypothesis results in a productive intervention. So that would be an example. Another one that I like is, I'm very preoccupied with the fact that in India in particular, we have some amazing scientists in our labs, and they never publish anything that is globally recognized. And is this because they don't have the infrastructure to do work that's at the cutting edge frontier? Is it because they don't know where the frontier is? in their particular subfield because of resource limitations or lack of networks, informational networks? Is it because there's a linguistic barrier in communicating? And so that whole area of how does technology progress, so that's in the interests of all, tech for all, right, is again subject to a few tools that we can create and run some experiments with scientists in different countries to say, you know, if you had this, would you do better? If you had that, would you do better, right? So there's a nice example in one of these slides. Is this the one? No. Yeah, it's called Finding the Global Scientific Frontier, right? So I wrote over here, build an app for scientists in the global south to measure if they can find the research frontier in their field, right? So in 2017, would a computer scientist in Nigeria know that the article on LLMs on the left would get 20 times the citations in the next few years compared to the article on random forest optimization on the right? And the gimmick there is that random forest optimization was something that everybody was studying for a while, and then the field moved on. But let's say that the field moved on, you know, at Harvard and MIT, and that knowledge is not quite disseminated down to every single university. So the most productive people somewhere else are still working on the older stuff, and the bang for the incremental hour of effort is not as great. So you can see how this is both correctable with a simple tech tool, informational tool, and potentially has big multiplier effects for development. So those are some of the examples. Okay. Good. So that's it. So, you know, tech for all, it's basically use of technology to stimulate better innovation for better societal development, and open academic efforts. So please join if you wish. And thank you for giving me the space to talk about it. And it's wonderful to connect with all of you.
Thank you, Tyrone. My charge is to make a concluding remark, and after I do that, I'm going to ask Bert to say a few words, if you don't mind, please, because you're one of the collaborators. But what is really very striking, allow me to take 2 minutes to say the following. We have the general purpose concept, codifying behavior, turn that into data. And we also have the technology and to squeeze knowledge out of the data. What we hear today is using this in a very widespread manner, allowing academics, ordinary people, companies, and all come together to really enhance our awareness of things, enhance the knowledge we could get from the data, improve our prediction, improve our optimization. Somehow, unfortunately, we worry so much about privacy. You know, the big countries, China, US, and EU, they are all talking about data privacy. They all worry about the big tech having the data and so become too powerful. And we worry about the government using the data to abuse human rights, et cetera, et cetera. But what Tyrone today demonstrates is that in many large corners of this world, we are far away from this kind of concern. We are at the corner. We need to move out of that corner and use what is available to allow a global collaboration. So in that sense, it's really well taken to have the title Tech for All. Forget about some of the concerns that the big guys worry about. We should really try to do the best we can to move ourselves out of the undesirable corner solution and make it tech for all. And Tyrone, that's very stimulating. And thank you very much. ABFER is very happy to have this opportunity to collaborate with ISAS and also EAI. So Bert, would you mind just a few words?
Just 3 words. Just to add my thanks, Tyrone. This was really very inspiring. I know you can talk for days on what you've just said, and I wish we had those days because it is really extremely profound, the number of things that you and then how you work with this very changed data environment that we all live in is really quite fascinating. I'd like to thank my partners, both Iqbal and Bernard, for organizing this together. And I'd like to thank all of you for really putting the boots on the ground and that have made this this work, and for coming to the event, either online or live. Thank you.
So we have to thank people like James and Jordan and all the team for putting this together. Having the audience and also the online is really fascinating. Tyrone, great job. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.